But now you know that those who are meant to understand will understand, and those who don't, they were never really listening. So you stop yelling. You start whispering to yourself, to those who meet you where you are, and your life begins to feel lighter. Not because everything is resolved, but because you've stopped carrying what was never yours. You begin choosing softness without shame. The world may still glorify the grind, the sharp edges, the tough skin, but you crave gentleness in people, in spaces, in words. You no longer want to fight your way through life. You want to move with grace, with ease. You let yourself cry at movies. You let your voice tremble in truth. You stop trying to sound certain when you're not. You let others witness your tenderness, not as a vulnerability to be exploited, but as a truth to be honored. And in doing so, you create space for others to soften too. Because your softness doesn't make you fragile, it makes you free. You realize that real love, whether it's from a partner, a friend, or yourself, won't ask you to shrink. You don't have to dim your joy to be less intimidating. You don't have to hide your sadness to be easier to be around. You don't have to filter your truth to be digestible. Real love invites you to be more of yourself, not less. It doesn't punish your honesty or weaponize your vulnerability. And when you encounter love like that, it feels like sunlight through your ribs. You exhale differently. You exist differently. Because love, when it's real, is not something you perform, it's something you rest in. You begin to forgive yourself for the ways you abandoned your truth just to belong, for the times you stayed silent to avoid conflict, for the dreams you buried to make others feel comfortable, for the boundaries you dissolved just to be accepted. You don't judge those parts of you anymore. You understand that they were surviving, that they did what they thought was necessary, but now you're choosing differently. Now you're choosing truth over approval. Now you're choosing authenticity over acceptance. And while that choice comes with grief, because not everyone stays, you wouldn't trade it. Because the version of you that is emerging is not just strong, she is sacred. You start to trust your own rhythm. You stop comparing your timeline to theirs. You stop looking at age as a deadline. You no longer feel the pressure to achieve, to arrive, to have it all figured out. Life feels less like a race and more like a song, and you are allowed to dance to your own beat. Some days are fast, some days are slow, some days are silent, but they're all part of the melody, and you begin to hear it now, not as background noise, but as music, your music, and you move to it with presence, with gratitude, with grace. You recognize the beauty in impermanence. Zen teaches us that everything is passing, each breath, each season, each emotion. And instead of fearing that, you begin to embrace it. You no longer cling so tightly. You don't grip love with desperation. You don't resist change with fear. You let the moments come and go, like waves. You touch joy with open hands. You hold sorrow without drowning in it. You understand that nothing is forever, and that's what makes it precious. You savor instead of possess. You experience instead of control. And this is freedom, not from feeling, but from clinging. You learn to sit in uncertainty without collapsing. The future used to feel like a threat. Every unknown was a cliff edge. But now it feels like a canvas. Not blank, but wide open, full of possibility. You don't need all the answers anymore. You just need the next right step. And even when that step is unclear, you know how to be with yourself in the waiting. You light a candle. You breathe. You let faith speak louder than fear. And slowly clarity returns. Not as a shout, but as a whisper. One you've learned to hear only by being still. And one day, without even noticing it, you catch yourself laughing. Not because something is funny, but because you feel light. You feel free. You feel like yourself. And it hits you that after all the heartbreak, all the letting go, all the nights you weren't sure you'd make it through, you've arrived. Not at a destination, but at yourself. And that is the most sacred homecoming of all. You begin to realize that peace isn't something that arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, in moments of clarity, in the way your shoulders finally relax when you're no longer forcing yourself to be okay. You used to think peace was a final destination, some fixed place you would reach once everything in your life aligned. But now you know peace doesn't wait for perfection, it lives in presence. It's in the breath you take when you choose not to respond to chaos. It's in the pause before reacting. Its impact depends entirely on intention. Are you quiet because you need stillness, or because you want someone to feel the weight of their absence? Are you creating space, or are you crafting a prison for them and for yourself? The young man asked, "But Master, what if they deserve my silence? What if the pain they caused is unforgivable?" The Master, ever gentle, poured a cup of water and slowly let it seep into the earth. "Water nourishes the soil," he said, "but too much and the roots drown. Too little and they wither. Words can be healing, but silence, when given too often or for the wrong reasons, becomes a desert. Nothing grows, nothing heals." The question then becomes, not if you should be silent, but why? If it's for peace, true peace, then let go fully. Release the person, release the story, release the weight. But if silence is a weapon, a way to control the narrative, to create guilt, to feel superior, then you're not free. You are still chained, and that chain will rust around your soul. That night, the young man went home and sat with the silence he had given others. He saw not power, but pain, not resolution, but residue. So he picked up a piece of paper and wrote a few simple words. "I do not hold anger anymore. May you be at peace." He didn't expect a reply. He didn't need one. The moment he sent it, something inside him shifted. He felt lighter, not because the other person had responded, but because he had finally released himself. Zen tells us, silence can be a sanctuary or a prison. Choose wisely. If your silence is rooted in bitterness, it's not peace. It's a wound that festers in the dark. But if your silence helps you release the burden, if it brings you closer to clarity, then it becomes a bridge to freedom. And freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a soft letting go, a quiet surrender, a breath unburdened by blame. So the next time you fall into silence, ask yourself, is this peace or punishment? Am I protecting my heart, or am I building walls no one can see through? Because the silence we give others will echo in our own hearts. And in that echo, we find the truth of our intentions, whether they liberate or imprison us. You begin to realize that silence has layers, that not every quiet is the same. There is the kind of silence that feels like rest, a sacred hush that falls over your life like snowfall, softening your rough edges and allowing your soul to breathe again. And then there is the kind of silence that feels like a scream swallowed whole, like a goodbye that never got spoken, like a room that used to echo with laughter and now only carries shadows. You've lived both. And the more life teaches you, the more you understand that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of what you refuse to say. It holds all the almosts, the I wish I hads, the I should have knowns. And sometimes it holds a truth so loud it never needed words in the first place. You sit with the memory of someone you once loved, someone who drifted from your life slowly, like the tide pulling away from the shore. At first you thought the silence was temporary, that space was healing, that one day they would reach out and you would pick up right where things left off. But days became months, and what once was a living, breathing bond turned into a memory sealed in glass. You never fought, you never screamed. There were no harsh words, just distance, just space, just the slow realization that not all things break with sound. Some simply unravel in silence. And that hurts more than any argument ever could, because arguments mean someone still cares enough to fight. But silence? Silence feels like being erased. It's the kind of grief you don't know how to explain, because there's no event, no ending, no closure. Just a gradual fading, a quiet ache. And in that space, you start to ask yourself the questions that have no easy answers. Was I too much? Not enough? Did they know how deeply I cared? Did I miss the signs? And the more you sit with those questions, the more you realize. Maybe the silence wasn't just theirs. Maybe you were quiet too. Maybe both of you stood at the edge, waiting for the other to speak, too scared to say what mattered most. So you go back, not in time, but in spirit. You revisit the unspoken things. You imagine the conversation you wish had happened, the one where you say, "I was scared too. I didn't know how to hold what we had without losing myself." The one where you hear them say, "I never meant to disappear. I just didn't know how to stay." And even though it's imagined, it brings something real: softness, understanding, for all the silences you regret and all the words you wish you'd had the courage to say. And in that forgiveness, a new kind of silence arrives, one that doesn't hurt, one that feels like stillness, like acceptance, like exhaling without apology. This is the silence Zen speaks of, not the one used to punish, but the one that allows everything to settle, the one that says, "I see what was, I honor it, and I let it go." You begin to examine the silences you carry into your relationships. You notice how often you hold back what you feel out of fear it will push someone away. You notice how many times you've chosen to stay quiet rather than risk conflict. How often you've said, "It's fine," when it wasn't. And how those small silences stack upon each other until one day, connection disappears beneath the weight of what was never expressed. You see now that silence can be a form of abandonment, not always of others, but of yourself. And you promise yourself no more shrinking, no more swallowing words that were meant to be shared. But you also learn to respect the silence that serves you, the kind that arrives after you've spoken your truth and chosen to rest, the kind that protects your peace when explanation is no longer required, the kind that replaces arguments with boundaries, not silence as avoidance, but silence as self-respect. Because not everything needs to be said. Not everyone deserves access to your vulnerability. And sometimes the most powerful response is no response. Not because you don't care, but because you care too much to re-enter spaces that broke you. You begin to recognize that some people weaponize silence. They use it to control, to manipulate, to make you question your value. They withhold love as punishment. They pull away without reason and wait for you to chase. And you used to fall for it. You used to believe their silence was your fault, that if you just did more, said less, made yourself smaller, they would return. But now you see it clearly. Silence that seeks to diminish you is not sacred. It's abuse in disguise. And you no longer play that game. You don't beg. You don't chase. You don't try to fill the void they created. You turn inward. You find your own voice. You fill your own silence with truth. And perhaps the most profound thing you come to understand is this: that the silence you feared all your life is not your enemy. It was always your teacher. It showed you what needed to be said. It revealed who was willing to meet you in truth and who only wanted to be met in comfort. It asked you to listen to your own heart, your own breath, your own intuition. And in listening, you found your way home. Not to them, to you. So now when silence comes, you don't resist it. You don't rush to fill it with noise. You sit with it. You let it speak. And sometimes you speak back, not always out loud, but always from within. You say, "I hear you. I see what you're showing me. I know now what I couldn't see before." And in that exchange, something shifts. Silence is no longer a threat. It's a companion, a guide, a mirror. Because the truth is, we all live between the things we say and the things we leave unsaid. And if we can begin to close that gap, to speak with intention, to listen with care, to use silence as a bridge instead of a blade, then maybe, just maybe, we can heal. Not just ourselves, but the spaces between us. One breath at a time, one truth at a time, one sacred silence at a time. You begin to understand how often people retreat into silence, not out of strength, but out of fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear that their truth, once spoken, will cause more harm than good. You've seen it in others and you've seen it in yourself. The way you've paused before saying what your heart truly needed to say. The way you rehearsed entire conversations in your mind but never let them leave your lips. You told yourself, "Now's not the time," or "They won't understand," or worse, "Maybe it doesn't matter anymore." But it always did. It always does, because unspoken truths don't vanish. They linger. They turn into tension in the body, into tightness in the chest, into dreams that echo things you never had the courage to say out loud. There was a time when you believed your silence protected others. You kept your pain to yourself, thinking it would spare them discomfort. You held your questions, your doubts, your fears, believing that by keeping peace externally, you were doing the right thing. But now you see, there's a difference between peacekeeping and truth-killing. What looks like calm on the outside can be chaos on the inside. And eventually that silence becomes a cage, and the person inside it starts to disappear. You begin to see that speaking your truth is not always comfortable, but it's necessary. You think of all the people you've encountered, those who disappeared without explanation, those who withdrew when things got hard, those who looked you in the eyes one day and vanished the next. For a while you took it personally. You thought their silence meant you weren't worthy of clarity. You believed the stories your mind created in the void they left behind. But with time and with healing, you came to understand. Their silence was not a reflection of your worth. It was a reflection of their own limitations. Some people can't face the truth, not because you don't deserve it, but because they haven't yet learned how to live in it themselves. And that's not your burden to carry. You begin to ask yourself what kind of silence lives in your relationships. Is it the silence that soothes or the kind that severs? Is it a pause for reflection or a barrier built out of fear? You start listening, not just to what people say, but to what they don't, to the spaces between their words, to the energy behind their pauses. And more importantly, you begin to listen to your own silence. You ask yourself, what am I not saying? And what am I afraid will happen if I do? And when the answers come, no matter how uncomfortable, you honor them. Because the truth can be hard, but pretending is harder. You begin to speak with more intention, not louder, not more frequently, but more honestly. You stop talking to be heard and start speaking to be real. You say what you mean, you ask for what you need, you apologize when necessary, you express appreciation when you feel it. You no longer wait for the perfect moment to say, I miss you, or that hurt, or I love you. Because life has taught you that silence can last forever. And some words, if left unspoken too long, turn into regrets. You're not trying to be perfect. You're just trying not to vanish from your own story. You also begin to listen more. You stop interrupting. You stop waiting for your turn to speak. You sit with others' words, even when they're messy or painful or hard to hear. You understand now that listening is not about agreeing. It's about honoring someone's reality. And sometimes the most healing thing you can say is nothing at all. Just being there, just witnessing, just staying with someone in their truth without needing to fix it. That becomes enough. That becomes sacred. You start viewing communication not as a performance, but as a practice, a daily choice, a discipline of the heart. You understand that being real is not about always having the right words. It's about having the right intention. And sometimes the most honest thing you can say is, I don't know what to say right now, but I'm here. Or, this is hard for me, but I want to talk about it. You stop striving for eloquence and start striving for presence, for honesty, for softness that doesn't shy away from complexity. You begin to notice how the world itself teaches you about silence, the way trees communicate without sound, the way the ocean speaks in waves, not words, the way the sky holds space for both light and storm. You learn that stillness is not absence, it's presence in its purest form. And you start cultivating that stillness in your own life. You find moments each day to unplug, to turn inward, to sit in quiet without reaching for distraction. And in those moments, you find that silence isn't empty. It's full of answers you couldn't hear when the world was too loud. You let go of the need to be understood by everyone. You accept that some people will misinterpret your silence, your words, your boundaries, and that's okay. You no longer feel the need to defend your truth in every room. You walk away from conversations that aren't rooted in mutual respect. You choose your peace over being right, and in doing so, you find a different kind of freedom. The freedom of not needing to explain yourself to feel valid. The freedom of letting silence be a statement, not of punishment, but of sovereignty. You also learn how to return from silence, how to re-enter conversations with grace, how to say, I needed time to process, but I'm ready now. Or, "I've been thinking about what you said." You stop using silence as a wall and start using it as a bridge, a way to pause, not to avoid. And when you offer that grace to others, they feel it. They feel safe, seen, honored, because you've come to understand that love is not always in the words. It's in the willingness to show up again, even after silence, especially after silence. And maybe the greatest lesson of all is this, that the silence between us is not what breaks us. It's what reveals what was always there. Some silences are filled with love too deep for language. Some are filled with avoidance too thick to cut through. And the wisdom lies in knowing which is which, because you're no longer trying to win, but simply trying to be true. You begin to sense how silence lingers long after words fade. It becomes part of the fabric between two people, a thread woven through shared looks, unmet glances, unfinished conversations. It's not just about what wasn't said, but about what was felt in the spaces between sentences. There were moments in your life when someone sat next to you and said nothing, and still, you felt heard. There were others when the silence between you screamed louder than any voice ever could. That's the paradox of silence. It can both connect and sever. It can be a resting place or a battlefield. And the only way to know the difference is to check the feeling it leaves in your chest after it has passed. You start reflecting on how often people retreat into silence because language fails them. Sometimes it's not about avoidance, it's about being overwhelmed, about having so much to say that nothing comes out, about wanting so badly to be understood, but not knowing how to begin. There's a tenderness in recognizing this, a gentleness in realizing that maybe their silence wasn't rejection, it was uncertainty, fear, grief. And when you approach silence with compassion instead of assumption, something softens inside you. You stop demanding perfect expressions and start creating safe spaces. Places where silence doesn't mean you've given up, but that you're still trying, still reaching, still here. You also begin to realize that silence is how many people survive. It's what children learn when their voices aren't safe in their homes. What partners learn when their feelings are dismissed in relationships. What dreamers learn in societies that don't make space for difference. Silence, in these cases, becomes a shield, a way to stay invisible so pain doesn't find you. But over time, the silence meant to protect becomes a trap. And that child, that partner, that dreamer begins to lose their sense of worth in the process. That's why you begin listening more closely to quiet people. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they've often had to hide the most. You remember a moment, perhaps small, almost forgettable, where someone's silence made you feel unseen. Maybe you were vulnerable. Maybe you shared something honest, raw, and all you received in return was a pause. A cold, uncomfortable pause. No reassurance, no empathy, just absence. That moment carved something into you, didn't it? It told you, in ways no words ever could, that your truth might be too much, that your presence wasn't worth the weight of response, and you carried that wound in places no one could see. But now you're beginning to heal, not just by talking more, but by offering yourself the voice you were denied, by reminding yourself that silence, when used without care, can wound, but your voice, when reclaimed with love, can restore. You begin paying attention to the silences you've inherited, the ones passed down through generations, the stories your family never told, the griefs no one named, the fears buried under laughter, under rituals, under stoic faces. You realize that silence doesn't just belong to you, it belongs to the ones who came before you. And in some ways, your healing becomes ancestral. You are the one who names what was unnamed, who breaks patterns by speaking gently where others shouted or shut down. You become the voice in the lineage who says, "This ends with me," not with rage, not with blame, but with compassion, with presence, with truth. You start recognizing that your silence also speaks in the way you move through the world, in the boundaries you don't set, in the truths you don't tell, in the way you hold your breath around people who've hurt you, hoping they won't notice the crack in your composure. You used to think silence only lived in the absence of sound, but now you see it lives in your posture, in your habits, in the way you edit yourself before entering a room, And once you notice it, you can't unsee it. You begin asking yourself, what am I still not saying? Not to others, but to yourself. And the answers that rise up might sting, but they free you. Because speaking truth doesn't always mean saying it out loud. Sometimes it's in the way you finally admit that you're tired, that a certain relationship no longer feels right, that you've outgrown something you once begged the universe to keep. Sometimes truth is the whisper in your own heart that says, you've tried enough. And when you listen, when you actually pause and listen, you realize you don't need permission to act on that knowing. You just need the courage to honor it, to make space for your voice in your own life. Now, you watch how your thoughts race at first, how your body resists the calm, but slowly with each breath, the storm inside you quiets. You realize that silence isn't empty. It's where truth finally becomes loud enough to hear. And in that space, you reconnect to something deeper than thought, deeper than feeling. You reconnect to your being, the part of you that existed before the noise, the part that needs no explanation. You start to see that not all silences are meant to be filled. Some are sacred, a shared gaze between two people who understand, a held hand in the middle of grief, a moment of awe beneath a star-filled sky. You stop rushing to say something just to make things more comfortable. You allow the quiet to speak, because sometimes the most loving thing you can offer is presence. Not advice, not solutions, just presence. And that presence becomes a balm. A reminder that you don't need to fix everything. You just need to show up. And yet you also learn when silence becomes betrayal, when staying quiet becomes complicity, when your refusal to speak truth enables harm. You start noticing the moments you've withheld truth, not out of wisdom, but out of fear. And you begin reclaiming those moments, not by shaming yourself, but by choosing differently next time. You speak when it's hard. You interrupt when someone's dignity is on the line. You stand tall, even when your voice shakes. Because you've learned that silence has power, but it is not always the kind of power you want to hold. Some silences protect peace, others protect pain. You're learning the difference, and you're choosing the path that feels clean, even if it's not easy, because you've come too far to live in suppression, you've worked too hard to shrink again, you've unraveled too much to go back to the tight spaces you once called home. Now your silence is sacred not because it hides, but because it honors. Now your voice is sacred not because it's loud, but because it's real. And both, when used with care, create a life that feels honest, whole, and truly yours. You begin to understand that silence is not simply something you experience. It's something you create, carry, and sometimes carry too long. There were times when you believed keeping the peace meant saying nothing, holding your tongue, letting moments pass unchallenged. And maybe that worked in the short term. Maybe it kept things smooth on the surface, but beneath you could feel it, the tension, the tightening, the growing ache of everything you weren't saying. You told yourself it wasn't the right moment, that speaking your truth might cause distance, might upset the balance. So you swallowed it, again and again, until silence became your second skin. But the body always remembers. It remembers the words you couldn't say, the feelings you buried, the boundaries you compromised just to avoid conflict. You can ignore the truth for a while, but your body will whisper what your voice refused to carry. And over time, that whisper becomes illness, heaviness, fatigue, not because you're broken, but because you were never meant to bear the weight of everything alone. So you begin to understand that speaking is not just about communication, it's about release, about honoring your body's need to be heard, even if the only person listening is you. You think back on the times people went silent on you, not because they were reflecting or healing, but because they didn't want to confront the discomfort of honesty. How it left you questioning your worth, questioning what you did wrong, when all you needed was truth, a word, a closure, something. But instead, they chose absence. And you were left to fill in the gaps with assumptions that hurt more than any truth might have. It took you time to realize that their silence was about them, not you, their discomfort, their avoidance, their own shadows. And even though that understanding didn't erase the pain, it gave you something else, freedom. You stopped romanticizing silence in relationships. You stopped believing that what's left unsaid somehow speaks louder. You stopped giving people credit for feeling things they never showed. Love, you've learned, is not meant to be guessed. It is meant to be expressed, clearly, gently, fully. And if someone cannot bring themselves to say what they feel, to explain what they need, to meet you in mutual vulnerability, then silence is no longer poetry, it's absence. And love cannot grow in absence. You begin to realize that silence has different textures. There is silence that soothes, the kind found in shared presence, in soft moments when no words are needed because hearts are aligned. And then there is the silence that slices, a cold, indifferent wall that leaves you standing alone with all your unanswered questions. And between those two, there is another kind of silence, the one you impose on yourself. The one where you know what you need to say, maybe habit, maybe the deep-rooted belief that your truth will be too much. But now you're asking yourself, too much for whom? And at what cost? You begin practicing courage, not in grand declarations, but in small truths. You say, I'm not okay today, when someone asks how you are. You say, that hurt, when a joke goes too far. You say, I need space, without guilt. You say, this matters to me, even when your voice trembles. And each time you speak these simple truths, your silence begins to loosen its grip. You're not shouting, you're not blaming, you're just being real. And being real is your return to yourself. You also learn to recognize when silence is the answer. Not out of avoidance, but because not every battle needs your energy. Not every conversation deserves your presence. Some people ask questions not to understand, but to provoke. Some arguments are disguised as concern, when really they're just invitations back into chaos. And in those moments, your silence is your sovereignty. You're not avoiding conflict, you're protecting your peace. And that peace, it's no longer up for negotiation. You start noticing how your silence shifts when you trust yourself. It no longer feels like fear. It feels like wisdom, like waiting for the right moment, like listening deeply, not just to others, but to your own inner voice. You don't rush to speak just to fill the air. You don't interrupt your own knowing just to maintain a conversation. You hold space, you pause, and in that pause, you find clarity, because sometimes what needs to be said becomes clearer in the stillness. You realize too that some of your deepest wounds were caused by things people never said, the apologies that never came, the affirmations you craved, the acknowledgement that was always just out of reach. And for a long time, you carried that ache like it was your fault. You believed that if you had just been different, quieter, better, less, you would have earned the words you longed to hear. But now you know better. Their silence was never a reflection of your value. It was a reflection of their capacity. And you are done punishing yourself for the limitations of others. You begin to reclaim silence as a sacred act. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of sacred pause. The kind that allows you to process before reacting. The kind that holds space for reflection before decision. You stop seeing silence as empty and start seeing it as preparation. For healing, for growth, for clarity. And you notice how much more grounded you feel when you don't rush to respond, when you allow space for your truth to ripen before you offer it to the world. You remember now that you can be both silent and expressive. That silence does not mean passive. It does not mean weak. It means deliberate. It means you're choosing what to say, how to say it, and when. It means you've learned to hold your voice with respect. You're not afraid to speak. You just don't need to fill every space. You don't need to convince, impress, or prove. You're simply at home in yourself. And that presence speaks louder than words ever could. You begin to find balance between your voice and your silence, between saying what matters and knowing when presence is enough. And in that balance, you find something else, a new relationship with yourself. One that is rooted not in noise or silence, but in choice. You choose how to show up. You choose how to respond. You choose when to speak and when to listen. And in making that choice, you reclaim the life that once felt like it belonged to everyone but you. You begin to understand that speaking your truth is an act of sacred rebellion. In a world that often teaches you to be agreeable, to be silent, to not make anyone uncomfortable, Choosing to voice your needs becomes an act of courage, especially when your voice shakes, especially when your truth isn't what others want to hear. But you speak anyway, not to be loud, not to be right, but to be whole, to no longer fracture yourself into silence for the sake of harmony that only exists on the surface. Because peace that costs your voice is not peace, it's self-erasure. And you're not here to disappear quietly. You're here to live fully honestly, even if your honesty trembles at first. You reflect on all the times you betrayed your own heart just to maintain someone else's comfort. All the times you said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. All the moments you gave permission for your boundaries to be crossed, just so no one would call you difficult. And at the time it felt easier, safer. But now it feels like grief. Grief for the self you muted. Grief for the pain you absorbed just to avoid conflict. And that grief isn't a weakness, it's a call back to yourself. A reminder that your voice matters, that your feelings matter, that you no longer have to earn your right to speak by being pleasing or palatable. You stop waiting for someone to rescue you from your silence. You stop waiting for the perfect listener, for the perfect timing, for someone to hand you permission. You realize that the most powerful validation comes from within, that you don't need someone to say, "I hear you," before you allow yourself to be heard. You begin writing letters you'll never send, speaking aloud in empty rooms, journaling thoughts that were never allowed to surface before. And in doing so, something sacred happens. Your inner voice begins to return. Not the one shaped by fear or expectation, but the one you were born with, the one that speaks with clarity, depth, and undeniable truth. You begin to understand that silence and voice are not enemies. They are companions. Silence allows space for your truth to surface. It gives your heart room to feel, your breath room to steady. And once you've listened deeply enough to your own soul, you know when it's time to speak. You know when the silence has done its part, and now your voice must rise, not as a weapon, but as a song. Not to overpower, but to clarify. Not to force, but to free. Because the words that emerge from a quiet heart carry a resonance that noise never could. You learn to speak with tenderness, even when your words are strong. You let go of the belief that being honest means being harsh. That clarity means confrontation. You find new language for old pain. You choose words that are honest but not wounding, direct but not defensive. You learn that it's possible to speak truth with kindness, to express anger with dignity, to set boundaries with grace. And in doing so, you not only honor your own truth, you create space for others to be real too. Because your vulnerability gives others permission to stop performing, to stop hiding, to meet you in what is real. You begin to find beauty in the unsaid too, not because you're afraid to speak, but because some things are understood in presence, in the way you hold someone's hand during their silence, in the way your eyes soften when someone else's voice breaks, in the shared exhale after a long, hard truth. You learn that words are not the only language love speaks. Sometimes love is in the silence that listens, in the quiet that holds space, in the stillness that stays when everything else runs. You reflect on your own silences, the ones you regret and the ones you are proud of. The time you didn't defend yourself when you should have. The time you let someone else speak over your truth. The times you said nothing when everything inside you wanted to scream. And yet, you also remember the moments your silence was strength. When you chose not to engage in arguments that would go nowhere. When you chose to pause instead of react. When you chose stillness as an act of faith. And so you stop judging your silence in black and white. You begin asking instead, what was I protecting in that moment? And the answers guide you, not toward shame, but toward understanding. You stop filling silences out of discomfort. You stop rushing to speak just because the quiet feels awkward. You allow yourself and others the space to breathe, to gather, to feel. You learn that not every gap needs to be filled, that sometimes silence is a gift, a place where hearts can meet without pressure, where souls can realign, where truth can echo back without being drowned out. You become more comfortable in the in-between, in the pause between question and answer, in the space between endings and beginnings. And in that space, you discover presence. You begin to speak up for the parts of you that were silenced long ago. The inner child who was told to be quiet, the teenager who was afraid of judgment, the adult who was shamed for needing too much. You bring their voices back. You tell them, you're allowed to speak now. You're allowed to be heard. You're allowed to take up space. And the more you do, the more you realize you're not broken. You were just quieted. And now you're finding the rhythm of your truth. Not all at once, but slowly, softly, surely. You begin choosing relationships where your voice doesn't have to beg to be valued, where your honesty isn't punished, where your needs aren't made to feel like burdens. You stop entertaining dynamics that require you to mute parts of yourself just to be loved. You choose spaces where your silence is respected and your words are welcomed. And in doing so, you begin to build a life that feels like home. Not because it's always easy, but because it's always real. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin to trust your own voice again. Not the one shaped by survival, not the one edited for approval, but the one that speaks from your soul, the one that says, there is a saying in Zen, the loudest sound in the world is silence. At first it sounds like a contradiction, something only a mystic would say, and only the quietest hearts could begin to grasp. But the more you live, the more you feel it. Not in your ears, but in your chest. Silence, you come to understand, isn't empty. It's alive. It holds everything we've ever been afraid to say. Every unspoken thought, every unmet apology, every hidden regret. And when words vanish, silence steps in and fills the space with something far more powerful than language. Raw emotion. Sometimes it arrives with peace, sometimes with confusion. But when silence is born from pain, it cuts in a way that no sound ever could. You learn that silence is not neutral. It can comfort, but it can also crush. You've seen how it plays both healer and executioner. When someone longs to be seen, acknowledged, forgiven, and they're met with nothing but emptiness, that silence is deafening. It's not just absence, it's a statement. And the most dangerous thing about it is that it allows the mind to create its own dialogue. Assumptions become louder than truth. Doubt takes over reason. And in the echo chamber of silence, even those who once felt certain begin to crumble under the weight of what they can't hear. There was a young man who once came to his Zen master carrying a storm within him, though his face remained still. They sat beneath the shade of an old tree, and time slowed down, as it often does in the presence of those who have learned the art of stillness. Finally, the young man broke the quiet. "Master," he said, "I've cut someone out of my life. They betrayed me, hurt me, and I've given them the most powerful response I could, my silence." His words trembled with a strange sense of pride, as though silence had become a sword he had finally learned to wield. The master didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward a tree nearby and gently pointed. "That tree once sheltered two birds," he said. "They built a nest together, laughed, chirped, danced in its branches, until one day one of them stopped singing, not because it had no voice, but because it wanted to be missed." The young man leaned in, curious. The master continued. "At first, the other bird waited, thinking it was a game. Then it worried. Then it stopped singing too. Eventually it flew away, heart heavy, never to return. And the bird who had chosen silence? It got what it wanted. Its absence was felt, but the nest was empty. The companionship was gone. And the silence it had once believed was power became its prison." The young man lowered his gaze. For the first time, he saw his silence not as triumph, but as loss. "But master," he said quietly, "isn't silence sometimes necessary? Isn't it protection?" The master nodded slowly. "Yes," he replied. "When silence is used to protect peace, it is wisdom. But when silence is used to punish, it becomes cruelty. If your silence brings you freedom, then keep it. But if your silence still ties you to resentment, then you are not silent. You are at war. There is an invisible wound that silence leaves behind. It's not made by what we say, but by what we withhold. Picture someone seeking your forgiveness, lost in the maze of their own regret, hoping for a single word, something, anything to know they're not invisible. And they're met with silence. Not peace, not compassion, just emptiness. This silence meant to protect you or punish them ends up echoing forever, not just in their soul, but in yours. Because what you refuse to say doesn't just disappear. It stays, it lingers, and over time, it begins to harden into bitterness. The Zen master once told another story about a traveler who lived in the mountains, a man known for his kindness, for the way he welcomed anyone who needed guidance. Until one day a friend betrayed him, lies were spread, trust was broken, and the traveler's response was not rage, it was silence. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse, he simply vanished from the relationship. Whenever the friend spoke, the traveler looked past him. Whenever he reached out, the traveler turned away. For days, weeks, months. The silence grew, and so did the weight of it. The friend, once arrogant, began to shrink. His pride wilted. His voice cracked when he tried again to make things right. He begged, not for forgiveness, but for acknowledgement. "Hate me if you must," he said, "but let me know I still exist to you." But the traveler turned his back. The friend left the village soon after, and he never returned. The traveler thought he had won. He believed he had found the perfect punishment. But as time passed, he found the silence